All right, welcome to the deep dive. Today we're going to be exploring some pretty fundamental ideas about language.
Yeah, we're taking a deep dive into the very nature of language itself.
And we're basing this exploration on a work that you brought to my attention called,
Existenzformen der Sprache.
Yeah.
It's by Sigmund and Silber, published back in 1975.
Existenzformen der Sprache.
Forms of existence of language, if you translate it.
Okay, so a German, or rather German and Russian, work from 1975. Now, this book, as I understand it, kind of gets into the weeds a bit. You know, it delves into some pretty complex academic theories about language and methodologies. Like they use this thing called a lexical statistical method to try and date prehistoric proto-language units. I mean, it's fascinating stuff, but maybe not for everyone.
Right, it can be a bit dense.
So for this deep dive, I think it makes sense for us to focus on the big picture stuff, right? The concepts that everyone can understand and relate to, no matter their background in linguistics.
Absolutely, yeah. I think there's a lot of really insightful perspectives on the nature and origins of language in this book that that can offer us a fresh way of thinking about something that we use every single day.
Exactly. So let's jump right in. One of the first questions that this book tackles, and it's a question that's been debated for centuries really, is what came first, thought or speech? The ultimate chicken or the egg scenario.
Right, it's a classic conundrum. I mean, do we need to be able to think in order to speak, or do we need to be able to speak in order to form complex thoughts?
Yeah, and the book actually presents a few different viewpoints on this. But one that I found particularly compelling is Friedrich Engel's argument that humans actually started speaking after they could already think relatively well.
That's interesting. So he's suggesting thought precedes language.
Yeah, and his reasoning, as the book presents it, is based on the sheer diversity of languages that exist in the world. He argued that this incredible variety of languages suggests that there were already pre-existing unique thought processes that led to these different ways of expressing ourselves.
I see. So if everyone thinks differently, naturally, their expressions in language would differ as well, leading to a multitude of languages.
Exactly. Now, the book does acknowledge that there's no way to definitively answer the question of which came first, because by the time we even started considering this question, both thinking and speaking already existed and were likely influencing each other.
Yeah, that makes sense. They were already so intertwined. But it is a fascinating idea to consider that some forms of thought may have actually predated spoken language.
It is. It is. And what's even more interesting is that the book also notes that the development of spoken language actually led to new forms of thought, including abstract thinking.
Oh, that's a good point. So it wasn't just a one-way street from thought to speech.
Right, exactly. Okay, so we've talked a bit about the possible origins of language. Now let's shift gears and look at some of the key characteristics of language that this book highlights.
Okay, sounds good.
One of the most fundamental features that the authors discuss is this idea of boundlessness and economy in language.
Boundlessness and economy.
Yeah, so boundlessness refers to the fact that even though we have a limited number of words at our disposal, they actually mention a maximum learning capacity for vocabulary of around 100,000 words. We can still use those words to express an almost limitless number of ideas and concepts. It's like having a finite toolkit, but with infinite possibility.
Wow, that is amazing when you think about it that way. We have this relatively small set of linguistic tools, but with those tools, we can literally say anything we want.
I know, right? It's incredible. What about economy?
Well, economy in language, as the authors use the term, has to do with, well, efficiency. We tend to find the quickest and most straightforward way to communicate an idea, even if the underlying grammar or the structure of our sentences might not fully capture the complexity of what we're trying to express.
That's an interesting point. So you're saying that as humans, we're kind of wired to streamline our communication, even if it means taking some shortcuts.
Exactly. I mean, think about it. When we're speaking, our main goal is to be understood, right? And sometimes that means prioritizing clarity and conciseness over, perfect grammatical form. And actually, the authors draw a really interesting parallel here to software development. They point out that many users often prefer a stable, functioning version of a program over the newest update, even if the newest update has more features, because ultimately they want something that's reliable and does what it's supposed to do.
Makes sense. We're creatures of habit. We like what we know. We want reliability.
Okay.
Now, beyond these core features, the book also brings up this very interesting concept of language as a creative activity.
Ah,
Okay.
yes. That's Wilhelm von Humboldt's idea.
Right, Wilhelm von Humboldt. And it's actually highlighted on page 184 of the book.
It is.
And the idea here is that to truly grasp what language is, we have to see it not as this static thing, this fixed system of words and rules, but rather as a dynamic, creative process.
Right. And the implication of Humboldt's view, as the book interprets it, is that speaking originates in thinking. So forming language is fundamentally a creative act driven by our thoughts.
Okay, so to kind of recap everything we've covered in this deep dive into Existenzformen der Sprache,
Right.
we have the age-old question of thought versus speech.
Right.
And while there might not be a definitive answer as to which one came first, the book presents some really interesting perspectives on the early, intricate relationship between these two things. How initial thoughts may have actually paved the way for speech, which then, in turn, expanded our capacity for even more complex thinking.
Yeah, it's a fascinating dance between the two.
And then we have these core characteristics of language, the seemingly paradoxical nature of it being both boundless in its expressive potential and economical in the tools that it uses. And finally, and I think this is really crucial, this idea from Humboldt that we have to understand language as this dynamic creative force, this force that is rooted in our own minds and our own individual thought processes.
Exactly. And what's so fascinating about this perspective is that it pushes us to think about language not just as this tool for communication, but as something that's actively shaping how we understand and interact with the world around us.
Right. It's not just a passive instrument. It's actively involved in shaping our reality. And that brings us to a final thought for you, our listener, and this builds directly on Humboldt's idea. How does viewing language as a creative act change how you approach communication, and even the way you formulate your own thoughts? Think about the implications of that shift in perspective in your daily life. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Thanks for listening.